Chapter 4. Next morning, when Madeline was aroused by her brother, it was not yet daybreak. The air chilled her. In the grey gloom, she had to feel around for matches and a lamp. Her usual manner vanished at a touch of the cold water. Presently, when Alfred knocked on her door and said he was leaving a pitcher of hot water outside, she replied with chattering teeth, "Thank you, but I don't need it now." She found it necessary, however, to warm her numb fingers before she could fasten hooks and buttons. And when she was dressed, she marked in the dim mirror that there was tinges of red in her cheeks. "Well, if I hadn't some color before," she exclaimed. Breakfast waited for her in the dining room. The sisters ate with her. Madeline quickly caught the feeling of a brisk action that seemed to be in the air. From the back of the house sounded the tramping of boots and voices of men, and from outside came a dull thump of hoofs and the rattle of harness and creaking of wheels. Then Alfred came stamping in. "Majesty, here's where you get the real thing," he announced merrily. "We're rushing you off, I'm sorry to say, but we gotta hustle back to the ranch. The fall roundup begins tomorrow. You'll be riding in the buckboard with Florence and Stillwell. I'll ride on ahead with the boys and fix up a little for you at the ranch. Your baggage will follow, but won't get there till tomorrow sometime. It's a long ride, nearly 50 miles by wagon road. Flo, don't forget a couple of robes. Wrap her up well and hustle getting ready. We're waiting." A little later, when Madeline went out with Florence, the grey gloom was lightening. Horses were champing at their bits and pounding gravel. "Mornin', Miss Majesty," said Stillwell gruffly from the front seat of the high vehicle. Alfred bundled her up into the back seat and Florence after her, wrapping them both with robes. Then he mounted his horse and started off. "Get on up," growled Stillwell, and with a crack of his whip the team started into a trot. Florence whispered into Madeline's ear, "Bill's kind of grouchy early in the morning. He'll thaw out soon as it gets warm out." It was still so grey that Madeline could not distinguish objects at any considerable distance, and she had left El Cajon without knowing what the town really looked like. "Here come the cowboys," said Florence. A line of horsemen appeared from the right and fell in behind Alfred, and gradually they drew ahead to disappear from sight. Meanwhile, Madeline watched them, the grey gloom lighting with dawn. All about her was bare and dark. The horizon seemed close. Not a hill nor a tree broke the monotony. The ground appeared to be flat, but the road went up and down over some little ridges. Madeline glanced backwards into the direction of El Cajon and the mountains she had seen the day before, and she saw only bare and dark ground like that which rolled before them. A puff of cold wind caught her face and she shivered. Florence noticed her and pulled up the second robe and tucked it closely round about her chin. "If we have a little wind here, you'll sure feel it," said the Western girl. Madeline replied that she already felt it. The wind appeared to penetrate the robes. It was cold and pure and nipping. The air was so thin she had to breathe as fast as if she was some unordinary exertion. It hurt her nose and made her lungs ache. "Are you cold?" asked Madeline. "I?" Florence laughed. "I'm used to it. I never get cold." The Western girl sat with ungloved hands on the outside of the robe she evidently did not need to draw up around her. Madeline thought she never saw such a clear-eyed, healthy, splendid girl. "Do you like to watch the sunrise?" asked Florence. "Yes, I think I do," replied Madeline thoughtfully. "Well, quite frankly, I haven't seen it for years." "We have beautiful sunrises and sunsets from the ranches. They're glorious." Long lines of pink fire ran level with the eastern horizon, which appeared to recede as the day brightened. A bank of thin, fleecy clouds were turning rose, and to the south and west the sky was dark, but every moment it changed, the blue turning bluer. Then in one place gathered a golden light and slowly concentrating until it was like fire. The rosy bank of clouds turned to silver and pearl, and behind it shot up a great circle of gold. Above the dark horizon gleamed an intense, bright disk. It was the sun. It rose swiftly, blazing out of the darkness between the ridges, and gave color and distance to the sweep of the land. "Well, well," drawled Stillwell, and he stretched his huge arm as if he had just awoken. "There's something to like." Florence nudged Madeline and winked at her. "Fine morning, girl," went on old Bill, cracking his whip. "His Majesty, it'll be some uninteresting riding all morning, but when we get up a bit you'll be sure liking it. There, look over the southwest, just over that farthest ridge." Madeline swept her gaze along the gray, sloping horizon line to where dark blue spirals rose far beyond the ridge. "That's Pentelico Mountains," said Still. "That there's home when we get there. We won't see no more of them till afternoon when they rise up kind of sudden like." Madeline murmured the melodious name. Where had she heard that? And then she remembered. The cowboy steward had told the little Mexican girl, Bonita, to hit the Peninsula Road. Probably the girl had ridden that big, dark horse over this very road at night, alone. Madeline had a little shiver that wasn't from the cold wind. "There's a jack!" cried Florence suddenly. Madeline saw her first jackrabbit. It was as large as a dog, and its ears were enormous. It appeared to be sort of tame, and the horses kicked dust over it as they trotted by. From then on, old Bill and Florence vied with each other in calling Madeline's attention to many things along the way. Coyotes stealing away into the brush, buzzards flapping over the carcass of a cow that had been mired in wash, queer little lizards running swiftly over the road, cattle grazing in the hollows, adobe huts and Mexican headers, and wild, shaggy horses with heads high, watching from the gray ridges. All these things Madeline looked at indifferently at first, because indifferent had become habitual for her, and then with an interest that flourished up, and insensibility grew as she rode on. It grew until she caught sight of a little ragged Mexican boy astride a burro, that she began to be awakened to the truth. She became conscious of faint, unmistakable awakening of long, dead feelings, enthusiasm and delight. When she realized that, she breathed deep of the cold, sharp air and experienced an inward joy. And then she divined, though she did not know why, that henceforth there was to be something new in her life, something she had never felt before, something good for her soul in the homely, the commonplace, the natural, and the wild. Meanwhile, as Madeline gazed about her and listened to her companions, the sun rose higher and grew warmer, and soared and grew hot. The horses held tirelessly to their steady trot, and mile after mile of rolling hill slipped by. From the top of a ridge, Madeline saw down into a hollow where a few of the cowboys had stopped and were sitting round a fire, evidently busy on the noonday meal. Their horses were feeding on the long gray grass. "Well, smell of that there greasewood makes my mouth water," said Stillwell. "I sure be hungry. We'll noon here and let the horses rest. It's a long pull yet to the ranch." He halted near the campfire and clambered down and began unharnessing the team. Florence leapt out and turned to help Madeline. "Walk around a little," she said. "You must be cramping from sitting down so long. I'll go help get lunch ready." Madeline got down and was glad to stretch her limbs and began to stroll around. She heard Stillwell throw the harnesses on the ground and slap his horses. "Roll around, you son of guns," he said. Both horses bent their forelegs, heaved down onto their sides, and tried to roll over. One horse succeeded on the fourth try, and then heaved up with a satisfied snort and shook off the dust and gravel. The other one failed to roll over and gave it up and half rose to his feet, then lay down on the other side. "He's sure gonna feel the ground," said Florence, smiling at Madeline. "Miss Hammond, I suppose that prize horse of yours, White Stockings, would spoil his coat if he were to roll around that greasewood and cactus." During lunchtime, Madeline observed that she was an object of manifestation, great interest to those three cowboys. She returned the compliment, and was amused to see that a glance their way caused them a painful embarrassment. They were grown men, one of whom had white hair, yet they acted like boys caught in the act of stealing a forbidden look at a pretty girl. "Cowboys sure are all flirts," said Florence, as if stating an uninteresting fact. But Madeline detected a merry twinkle in her eye. The cowboys heard, and the effect upon them was magical. They felt ashamed confusion and hurried to useless tasks. Madeline found it difficult to see where they had been bold, though evidently they were stricken with conscious guilt. She recalled appraising looks of critical English eyes, impudent French stares, and burning Spanish glances, gallants which any American girl had to run abroad. Compared with foreign eyes, the eyes of these cowboys were those of eager, smiling babies. "Ah, ah!" roared Stillwell. "Florence, you just hit the nail on the head. Cowboys are all plumb flirts. I was wondering why them boys nooned yonder. There ain't no place to noon here. Ain't no grazing or wood without burning and nothing. Them boys just held up and throwed the packs and waited for us. It ain't so surprising for Bully and Ned, they're young and coltish, but Nels there, why, he's old enough to be the pa of both you gals. It sure is amazingly strange." A silence ensued. The white-haired cowboy Nels fussed aimlessly around the campfire, and then straightened up with a very red face. "Bill, you're a doggone liar," he said. "I reckon I wouldn't stand to be classed with Bully and Ned. There ain't no cowboy on this range that's more appreciating of them ladies than me, but I sure ain't riding out of my way. I reckon I have enough riding to do already. Now, Bill, if you're such doggone good eyes, maybe you seen something on the way out." "Nels, I ain't seen nothing," replied bluntly. His levity disappeared in the old wrinkles and narrowed around his searching eyes. "Well, just squint at them there horse tracks," said Nels, and he drew Stillwell a few paces aside and pointed to a large hoofprint in the dust. "I reckon you know the horse that made them." "Well, that's Gene Stewart's roan, or I'm a son of a gun," exclaimed Stillwell, and he dropped heavily to his knees and began to scrutinize the tracks. "My eyes are sure poor, but Nels, they ain't fresh. I reckon them tracks was made early yesterday morning." "Well, what if they was?" Stillwell looked at his cowboy. "It sure as that red nose of yours Gene wasn't riding the roan. Bill, it's more'n your eyes is be getting old. Just foller them tracks, come on." Stillwell walked slowly with his head bent, muttering them to himself. Some 30 paces or more from the campfire, he stopped short and again flopped to his knees. Then he crawled around, evidently searching and examining the horse tracks. "Nels, whoever was astride Stewart's hoss met somebody, and they hauled up a bit, but didn't get down." "Well, it's tolerable good of you, Bill, that there reasoning," replied the cowboy. Stillwell presently got up and walked swiftly to the left for some rods and halted, and faced towards the southwest and then retraced his steps. He looked at the cowboy. "Nels, I don't like this any at all," he growled. "Them tracks be making straight for Pelco Trail." "Sure do," replied Nels. "Well," went on Stillwell impatiently, "I reckon you know what horse made the other tracks." "I'm thinking hard, but I ain't sure." "It's Danny Maine's bronc." "And how do you know that?" demanded Stillwell sharply. "Bill, the left front hoof of that little horse always wears a shoe that sort of sets crooked. Any of the boys can tell you I'd know that track if I was blind." Stillwell's ruddy face clouded and he kicked at a cactus plant. "Was Danny coming or going?" he asked. "I reckon he was hitting across country for Plancio Trail, but I ain't sure of that without back trailing him a ways. I just waited for you boys to come on up." "Nels, you think the boys sloped with that little hussy Bonita?" "Bill, he sure was sweet on Bonita, same as Jean was, and Ed Litton before he got engaged and all the boys. She sure is chain lightning, that black-eyed devil. Danny might have sloped with her all right. Danny was held up on the way to town, and then in the shame of it all he got himself drunk, but he'll show up soon." "Well, maybe you boys are right. I believe you are, Nels. There ain't no doubt on earth about who was riding Stewart's horse." "Well, it's as plain as a horse's tracks." "Well, it's almighty strange. It beats me. I wish the boys would ease up on drinking. I was pretty fond of Danny and Jean. I'm afraid Jean's done for, though. If he crosses the border where he can fight, it won't take long for him to get plugged. I guess I'm getting old. I don't stand things like I used to." "Bill, I reckon we better hit the Pelonco Trail. Maybe I can find Danny." "I reckon you had, Nels," replied Stillwell, "but it don't take in more'n a few days. We can't do much of the roundup without you. I'm kind of short on boys." That ended the conversation. Stillwell immediately began to hitch up his team, and the cowboys went out to fetch their stray horses. Madeline had been curiously interested, and she saw that Florence knew it. "Things happen, Miss Hammond," she said soberly, almost sadly. Madeline thought, and then straightway Florence began brightly to hum a tune and to busy herself with repacking what was left of lunch. Madeline suddenly conceived a strong liking and respect for this Western girl. She admired the concentration and dedication or wisdom or whatever it was which kept Florence from asking her of what she knew or thought or felt about the events that had taken place. Soon they were once more bowling along the road down a gradual incline, and then they began to climb a long rise that had for hours hidden what lay beyond. That climb was rather tiresome, owing to the sun and the dust and the restricted view. When they reached the summit, Madeline gave a little gasp of pleasure. A deep, gray, smooth valley opened below and sloped up the other side in little ridges like waves, and those led to foothills dotted with clumps of brush or trees, and beyond rose dark mountains, pine-fringed and craggly. "Well, Miss Majesty, now we're getting somewhere," said Stillwell, cracking his whip. 10 miles across this valley, and we'll be in the foothills where the Apaches used to run." 10 miles! exclaimed Madeline. "It looks no more than half a mile to me." Well, young woman, before you go riding off alone, you want to get your eyes corrected to western distances. Now, what do you call them black things off that there slope? Horsemen. No, cattle, replied Madeline doubtfully. Nope, just plain everyday cactus. And over here, look down the valley. Something of that pretty forest, ain't it? He asked, pointing. Madeline saw a beautiful forest in the center of the valley towards the south. Well, Miss Majesty, that's just their deceiving air. There ain't no forest. It's just a mirage. Indeed. How beautiful it is. Madeline strained her gaze at the dark blot, and it seemed to float in the atmosphere, to have clearly defined margins to waver and shimmer, and then it faded and vanished. The mountains dropped down again behind the slope, and presently the road began once more to slope up. The horses slowed to a walk, and there was a mile of rolling ridge, and then came the foothills. The road ascended through winding valleys. Trees, brush, rocks began to appear in the dark ravines. There was no water, yet along the sandy washes were indications of floods at some point. The heat and the dust stifled Madeline, and she had already become tired. Still, she looked with all of her eyes and saw birds, beautiful quail with crests, and rabbits, and once she saw a deer. Miss Majesty, said Stillwell, in the early days the Indians made this country a bad one to live in. I reckon you never heard much about them times. Surely you was hardly born then. I'll have to tell you some day how I fought the Comanches in the Panhandle. That's northern Texas. And I had some almighty hair-raising scares in this country with Apaches. He told her about Cochise and the chief of the Apaches, the most savage and bloodthirsty tribe that ever made life a horror for the pioneer. Cochise befriended the whites once, but he was the victim of that friendliness, and he became the most implacable of foes. And then Geronimo, another Apache chief, had, as late as 85, gone on the warpath and had left a bloody trail down the New Mexico and Arizona line almost to the border. Lone ranchmen and cowboys had been killed. Mothers had shot their children and then themselves as they approached the Apaches. The name Apache curdled the blood of any woman of the Southwest in those days. Madeline shuddered, and was glad when the old frontierman changed the subject and began to talk of the settling of this country by the Spaniards, the legend of lost gold mines handed down to the Mexicans, and strange stories of heroism and mystery and religion. The Mexicans had not advanced much in spite of the spread of civilization to the southwest. They were still superstitious and believed the legends of treasures hidden in the walls of their missions, and that unseen hands rolled rocks down the gullies upon the heads of prospectors who dared hunt for the lost mines of the Padres. Up in the mountains back of my ranch there's a lost mine, says Stillwell. Maybe it's only a legend, though, but somehow I believe it's there. Other lost mines have been found, and as for the rolling stones, I sure know that there's true, as anyone can find out if he goes trailing up the gulch. Maybe that's only the weathering of the cliffs, though. It's a sleepy, strange country, this Southwest, and Miss Majesty, you're gonna love it. You'll call it romantic. Well, I reckon romantic is correct. A feller gets lazy out here and dreamy, and he wants to put off work till tomorrow. That's the Mexican of it. Well, I like to think best of what a lady once said to me. An educated lady like yourself, Miss Majesty. Well, she said it's a land where it's always afternoon. I like that. I always get up sore in the morning and don't feel like anything. And sunset is my time. I reckon I don't want nothing any finer than sunset from my ranch. You look out over a valley that spreads wide between the mountains, and down the road you see the red Arizona desert clear to the Sierra Madres in Mexico. 200 miles, Miss Majesty, and all as clear as print. And the sun sets behind all that. When my time comes to die, I'd like to be on my porch smoking my pipe and facing the west." So the old cattleman talked on, while Madeline listened, and Florence dozed in her seat, and the sun began to wane, and the horses climbed steadily. Presently, at the foot of the steep ascent, Stillwell got down and walked, leading the team. During this long climb, fatigue claimed Madeline, and she drowsily closed her eyes, to find when she opened them again that the glaring white sky had changed to a steel blue. The sun had snuck behind the foothills, and the air was growing chilly. Stillwell had returned to the driving seat and was chuckling to the horses. Shadows crept up on the haulers. "Well, Flo," said Stillwell, "I reckon we had better rest that lunch before dark." "You didn't leave much of it," laughed Florence, as she produced the basket from under the seat. While they ate, the short twilight shadowed and the gloom filled the hollows. Madeline saw the first star, a faint winking point of the sky. The sky had now changed to a hazy gray. Madeline saw it gradually clear and darken to show other faint stars. After that there was a perceivable deepness of the gray, and an enlarging of the stars and a brightening of the newborn ones. Night seemed to go on, the cold wind. Madeline was glad to have the robes close around her and lean against Florence. The shadows were now black, but the tops of the foothills gleamed pale in the soft light. The steady tamp of the horses went on, and the creak of the wheels and the crunching of gravel. Madeline grew so sleepy that she could not have kept her weary eyelids from falling. There was drowsier spells in which she lost a feeling of where she was, and these were disturbed by the jolt of wheels over a rough place. And then came a blank interval, short or long, which ended in a more violent lurch of the buckboard. Madeline awoke to find her head on Florence's shoulder. She sat up laughing and apologized for her laziness. Florence assured her that they would soon reach the ranch. Madeline observed then that the horses were once more trotting. The wind was colder, the night darker, the foothills flatter, and the sky was now a wonderful deep velvet blue, blazing with millions of stars. Some of them were magnificent. How strangely white and alive. Again, Madeline felt the insistence of a familiar yet baffling association. These white stars called strangely to her, or haunted her. End of chapter 4.